The old gas station sat quiet under the heat of the midday sun, the smell of dust and oil thick in the air. It had been a slow afternoon, until the roar of motorcycles shattered the silence. A gang of bikers, their leather vests marked with patches of past crimes, rolled into the lot like a storm brewing on the horizon. At first, it seemed like just another stop, another place to flex their dominance, but they had no idea whose land they had just stepped onto. Inside the station, Laura Thompson wiped her hands on a rag, stepping away from the register as she saw them through the window. A lifetime of running this place with her husband, Daniel, had taught her how to handle rough men. But these weren't just rough. They were predators, the kind that didn't just want a beer or a tank of gas. They wanted control. The leader, a broad-shouldered brute with a snake tattoo winding up his neck, grinned as he stepped inside, his boots heavy on the worn tile floor. The others followed, their presence sucking the air from the room. Laura met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she said, her voice even, refusing to show fear. The leader smirked. "Ain't no need to be so formal, sweetheart. We're just here to get acquainted." His men chuckled, their eyes roaming over her in a way that turned her stomach. She reached for the phone under the counter, but one of them, a lanky man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned over and yanked the cord from the wall. "No need for that," he sneered. "We just want to have a little chat." Outside, a cloud of dust rose on the road leading to the station. A lone figure approached, his silhouette cutting against the harsh light of the sun, broad shoulders, a powerful stride. The calm before the storm. Daniel Thompson had just come home. The bikers had no idea. No idea that the woman they were cornering was married to a man who had spent years behind enemy lines, fighting battles they could never comprehend. A man who didn't tolerate threats. A man who had taken down some of the world's most dangerous enemies. And today they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Daniel Thompson stepped out of his truck, his boots hitting the gravel with a deliberate weight. The heat clung to his skin, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the scene unfolding inside the gas station, the glass windows giving him a clear view of Laura, standing firm behind the counter, and the group of leather-clad bikers closing in on her. His grip on the truck door tightened. Years of combat had honed his instincts, and everything about this situation screamed danger. The leader, the one with the snake tattoo, leaned in closer to Laura, his grin widening as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face. She jerked back, her eyes flashing with defiance, but the tension in her shoulders told Daniel everything he needed to know. Inside, Laura kept her chin high. She had never been one to back down, but she wasn't foolish. She knew the moment they walked in that they weren't here to buy anything. They were here to intimidate, to amuse themselves at her expense. But she also knew something they didn't, her husband, and if they weren't careful, they'd learn about him the hard way. The snake-tattooed leader, Carter, she heard one of the others call him, rested a hand on the counter and tapped the surface with a ring-covered finger. "Now, sweetheart, don't be so cold. We're just looking for some hospitality." His voice was smooth, but it carried the unmistakable edge of someone used to getting his way. "How about you pour us a drink? Maybe have a little conversation." One of the others, a stocky man with a thick beard, chuckled. "Yeah, we don't bite, unless you ask real nice." The group burst into laughter. Laura's fingers twitched toward the baseball bat she kept under the counter, but before she could react, the glass door swung open with a sharp chime. The laughter stopped. Daniel walked in, his presence filling the space like a wave crashing against the shore. He didn't say a word at first, just took in the room. The bikers, Laura, the unplugged phone, the way Carter's fingers lingered too close to his wife. Then he stepped forward, slowly, controlled, like a predator sizing up his prey. "Something I can help you boys with." His voice was steady, calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet threat woven into the words. Carter turned, looking Daniel up and down. He saw the rugged face, the strong frame, but he didn't recognize the danger in those eyes. "And who might you be, cowboy?" Daniel's expression didn't change. He reached up and unfastened the button on his sleeve, rolling it back with deliberate precision. The movement exposed his forearm, revealing an old but unmistakable tattoo, an insignia that only a select few would recognize, the mark of the Navy SEALs. Carter's smirk faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly, glancing at his crew before scoffing. "That's supposed to mean something?" Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Depends. How much do you like your teeth?" The room went silent. The bikers exchanged glances, processing the sudden shift in the air. The stocky man stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "You got a mouth on you, old man." Daniel didn't blink. "And I got hands too. Want to see how they work?" Carter narrowed his eyes, something unreadable passing over his expression. He was trying to gauge the threat, trying to decide if this was just some old war vet with an attitude or something more dangerous. But Daniel wasn't interested in games. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. The movement wasn't aggressive, but it was intentional, forcing Carter to either hold his ground or step back. For the first time, the leader hesitated. Outside, the distant rumble of another motorcycle engine broke the silence. One of the bikers turned his head slightly, distracted just enough for Daniel to make his next move. Fast, precise, a blur of motion. Before anyone could react, Daniel's hand shot forward, gripping Carter's wrist in a vice-like hold. In one swift motion, he twisted, forcing the man's arm behind his back and slamming him against the counter. Carter grunted in pain, his cocky demeanor shattering in an instant. "Here's what's gonna happen," Daniel said, his voice low and controlled. "You and your boys are gonna walk out that door. Get on your bikes and never set foot in this place again." The stocky biker took a step forward, reaching for something at his waist. Daniel's eyes flicked to him, and with a slight increase in pressure, Carter let out a strangled gasp. "Try it," Daniel warned, "and I promise you, he's not leaving with that arm intact." Silence. Thick, heavy. Laura, standing just a few feet away, watched the scene unfold, her chest tight with both anxiety and awe. She had seen Daniel in action before. She knew what he was capable of, but every time, it still took her breath away. Carter's fingers twitched, his breathing heavy. He knew he was beaten. "All right," he finally ground out. "All right, we're leaving." Daniel held his grip a moment longer, just to make sure the lesson had sunk in. Then he released him, stepping back as Carter stumbled forward, rubbing his arm. "Smart choice," Daniel said. The gang hesitated, anger simmering beneath the surface, but they knew better than to test him again. One by one, they backed toward the door, their earlier bravado now a distant memory. As they pushed through the entrance, Carter turned back, his jaw tight. "You just made an enemy today, old man." Daniel smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "No, I just let you walk away." Carter held his gaze for a second longer, then turned, leading his men back to their bikes. The engines roared to life, the sound gradually fading as they sped down the road, disappearing into the distance. Laura exhaled, finally letting the tension leave her body. Daniel turned to her, his eyes softening. "You okay?" She nodded, stepping into his arms. "You always show up right on time." He kissed the top of her head, then glanced back at the door. They won't be back, and if they were, he'd be ready. The bikers' engines faded into the distance, but Daniel knew this wasn't over. Men like Carter didn't take humiliation lightly. They would stew, let their anger fester, and eventually they'd come back thinking they had something to prove. Daniel had seen it 100 times before. Whether it was in war zones or back home, ego-driven men always made the same mistake. He released a slow breath, his muscles still coiled tight. Laura stepped away slightly, her hands resting on his chest, concern clouding her eyes. "They'll come back, won't they?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Daniel nodded. "Probably." His voice was calm, measured, "but they'll regret it." Laura sighed, glancing toward the gas station door, still slightly ajar from the biker's exit. The wind blew dust through the threshold, as if nature itself was trying to cleanse the place of their presence. She shook her head, frustrated. "We should call the sheriff." Daniel hesitated. Sheriff Collins was a good man, but this county was vast, the kind of place where law enforcement was spread thin. By the time Collins responded, the damage could already be done. Besides, this was something Daniel preferred to handle on his own terms. "I'll give him a heads up," he said. "But we both know they won't wait for him to get here." Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, but she also knew Daniel. She knew he wasn't just a soldier. He was something else, something more dangerous. A man who had lived through hell and come back sharper, deadlier. And when he said he would handle it, he meant it. She sighed. Just be careful. Daniel smirked slightly, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Careful is what keeps me alive. That night, the sky was a deep, endless black, the kind that swallowed sound and left only the distant hum of cicadas in its wake. Daniel sat on the porch, a cold beer in his hand, his rifle resting against the railing. He wasn't a paranoid man, but he wasn't careless either. He knew their type. Carter and his gang were prideful, arrogant. They wouldn't let what happened at the gas station slide. They'd come for revenge, thinking they had the numbers, thinking they could overwhelm him. They were wrong. A distant rumble broke the silence, low and steady. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the road leading to the house. Headlights flickered in the distance, growing brighter. They were coming. He didn't move, just took another slow sip of his beer, watching the approach. His fingers rested lightly on the stock of his rifle, but he didn't need it yet. Not yet. He let them come, let them think they had the upper hand. The first bike pulled into the driveway, followed by 3 more. Carter dismounted first, his boots crunching against the gravel. The others followed, fanning out slightly, their silhouettes framed by the glow of their headlights. Daniel counted them. 6 this time. They had brought reinforcements. Carter's grin was back, but there was something harder in his eyes now. "I told you," he called out. "You made an enemy today." Daniel exhaled slowly, setting his beer down on the armrest. "Funny thing about enemies," he said, standing up. "They tend to disappear when they pick the wrong fight." Carter's smirk twitched. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a switchblade, flicking it open with an audible snick. One of the others cocked a shotgun, the sound echoing through the still night air. Daniel didn't flinch. "Last chance, old man," Carter said, stepping forward. "Apologize. Maybe we just rough you up a little instead of breaking every bone in your body." Daniel tilted his head, considering. Then, faster than anyone could process, he moved. His hand shot forward, gripping Carter's wrist before the biker even realized what was happening. A sharp twist, Carter screamed, the knife clattering to the ground. In the same motion, Daniel drove his fist into the man's gut, sending him stumbling backward. The others surged forward, but Daniel was already in motion. He pivoted, grabbing the shotgun-wielding biker's wrist and yanking him forward, using his own momentum against him. A quick, brutal elbow to the jaw sent the man sprawling. Another lunged with a metal pipe. Daniel ducked, catching the thug's wrist mid-swing, twisting it sharply until the man howled in pain. He stripped the pipe from his grasp and slammed it across his knee, snapping it in half before tossing the useless pieces to the ground. 3 were down in seconds. The remaining bikers hesitated now, the fight draining from their eyes as they realized they weren't up against some retired gas station owner. This was something else entirely. Daniel stepped forward, his movements slow, controlled like a predator savoring the moment. Still feeling brave, one of them, stocky-beard, reached for his waistband, but before he could draw, a sharp crack echoed through the air. Laura stood on the porch, Daniel's shotgun in her hands. She hadn't fired at them, but the message was clear. "Unless you want me to actually pull the trigger," she called, "I'd get back on those bikes." Silence. The bikers, rattled and bruised, exchanged uncertain glances. Carter, still clutching his ribs, spat on the ground. "This ain't over." Daniel smiled, a slow, knowing grin. "Yeah, it is." They hesitated a moment longer, then one by one, they retreated. The roar of engines filled the night as they peeled away, disappearing into the darkness. Daniel watched them go, his pulse steady, his expression unreadable. Laura lowered the shotgun, shaking her head. "I swear you attract trouble like a magnet." Daniel chuckled, stepping toward her. "Keeps things interesting." She rolled her eyes but didn't pull away when he wrapped an arm around her waist. "You think they'll be back?" Daniel looked out into the dark, considering. "No," he said finally, "not after tonight. And if they did, he'd be ready." The night had barely settled when Daniel noticed something unusual. Headlights approaching from the far end of the property. Not from the main road, but from the tree line, where no road should be. He didn't move immediately, just took another slow sip of his beer. His gaze locked on the creeping beams of light filtering through the brush. His fingers tightened around the armrest, a subtle shift in his posture as his instincts flared. This wasn't a retreat. This was an ambush. Laura stood beside him, shotgun still in hand, her fingers flexing on the stock. "That's not the bikers leaving," she said under her breath. Daniel nodded. No, it's them coming back. He exhaled through his nose, setting his beer down without a sound. They're testing us, seeing if we'll scare easy. He glanced at her, his voice low and steady. Stay inside. Keep the shotgun loaded. Laura clenched her jaw. Like hell. Daniel almost smirked, but there wasn't time for arguments. The first bike emerged from the brush, moving slow, deliberate, then another and another. 6 riders in total, headlights cutting through the darkness like hunting dogs sniffing out their prey. Carter was at the front, nursing the bruises from their last encounter, but now he had a rifle slung across his chest. The cocky smirk from earlier was gone, replaced with something colder, something more dangerous. Daniel took a step off the porch, his boots crunching against the dirt. He rolled his shoulders, exhaling slow. Round 2 already. Thought you boys might take the night to lick your wounds. Carter slid off his bike, his movements stiff. He motioned to one of his men, who handed him a crowbar. You embarrass me, old man. His voice was raw with contained rage. Now I'm going to make an example out of you. Another biker, a tall, wiry man with a scar down his cheek, spoke up. You ain't got your little ambush ready this time. No tricks, just you against us. Daniel smirked. Funny thing about tricks, he said, rolling back his sleeves. People always assume they're done after the first act. Carter's eyes flickered to the tattoos on Daniel's arms. Military insignia, combat patches, SEAL team markers. His grip on the crowbar tightened, but for the first time, hesitation flickered in his expression. The doubt was there. He was trying to ignore it, trying to force himself into the role of the aggressor, but Daniel saw it, and that was all he needed. So what's the plan? Daniel asked, his voice casual, almost mocking. You shoot me, you burn down my house, beat me to a pulp in front of my wife. What's the end game here, Carter? The biker leader stepped forward, the crowbar swinging lightly in his grip. I don't need an end game, just a message that no one makes a fool out of me. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. That's the problem with men like you. You think respect comes from fear. He took another step forward, shoulders relaxed, posture loose. But I promise you, when the fear runs out, the only thing left is regret. Carter sneered. You talk too much. He lunged. Daniel moved. Fast. Faster than anyone expected. His arm shot up, catching Carter's wrist mid-swing, stopping the crowbar before it could land. Then, with a sharp twist, he turned the weapon against its wielder, yanking Carter forward and slamming the crowbar into his ribs. The crack echoed through the night. Carter stumbled back, gasping, eyes wide in shock. The other bikers hesitated for just a second, just long enough for Daniel to strike. He pivoted, stepping into the space of the next closest thug, his elbow slamming into the man's throat. A wheeze, a choke, and the biker went down hard, clutching his windpipe. 2 more rushed in. Daniel ducked the first swing, pivoted, and drove his knee into the ribs of the attacker. The other swung a knife. Daniel caught his wrist, twisted, and drove his own forehead into the man's nose, sending him crumpling to the ground. 3 down, 3 left. Carter, still gasping, scrambled for the rifle slung across his chest. Daniel didn't give him the chance. He surged forward, grabbing the barrel, forcing it upward as the trigger was pulled. A shot rang out, punching a hole into the sky. Daniel twisted the rifle free, pivoted, and struck Carter across the face with the stock. Blood sprayed. Carter hit the ground. The remaining 2 bikers saw their leader fall, saw their numbers dwindling, and realized something important. They had made a mistake. Daniel stepped over Carter's groaning form, the rifle hanging loosely at his side. He looked at the last 2 standing men and tilted his head, still feeling brave. They ran, jumped on their bikes, engines roaring to life as they peeled off into the night, leaving Carter and the others sprawled in the dirt. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. Thought so. Behind him, Laura stepped down from the porch, shotgun still in hand. She looked at Carter, bleeding and gasping, then back at her husband. Are they done? Daniel glanced toward the distant roar of engines, then back at the battered leader at his feet. He crouched, gripping Carter's collar, forcing him to look him in the eye. You ever come back here? He said, voice quiet, lethal. I won't stop at breaking bones. He let him go, standing up. Carter groaned, rolling onto his side. Daniel turned to Laura, nodding. Yeah, they're done. He looked back down at Carter one last time, then toward the dark road ahead. "But if they're not," he muttered. "I'll be ready." Laura stood beside Daniel, her shotgun still gripped tightly in her hands, her breathing steady but measured. The adrenaline had not yet left her system, and she could feel the rapid beat of her own heart in her chest. The bikers lay sprawled in the dirt, groaning in pain, some barely able to move. Carter, their leader, was coughing up blood, his face swollen from where Daniel had struck him with the rifle. The night was eerily quiet now, the previous chaos leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Daniel's stance remained firm, his gaze fixed on Carter, waiting to see if the man still had any fight left in him. Carter blinked up at him, his lips parting as if to spit some last insult, but no words came. Instead, he grimaced, struggling to sit up, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "You think this is over?" he croaked, his voice rough from pain. "You don't know who you're messing with." Daniel exhaled through his nose, barely shaking his head. "No, Carter, you don't know who you're messing with." He crouched down, gripping the battered biker by the collar, forcing him to meet his eyes. "You think I don't know men like you? I've dealt with worse in places you wouldn't last a day, and every single one of them thought they were untouchable, until they weren't." He let go, watching as Carter winced, his breath coming out ragged. The remaining bikers, still conscious, exchanged uneasy glances. Their confidence was gone, replaced with uncertainty, with fear. Daniel could see it in their eyes. They were re-evaluating their entire situation, realizing they had underestimated the wrong man. "Get up," Daniel ordered, voice sharp, controlled. Carter hesitated, but there was no defiance left in him. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself onto his knees, then onto his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he steadied himself with sheer force of will. He looked at his men, what was left of them. A few had already crawled toward their bikes, trying to avoid any further humiliation. Carter clenched his fists, but it wasn't in anger anymore. It was frustration. He had lost, and he knew it. "You don't understand," he muttered, voice low. "I got people who are going to hear about this." Daniel shrugged. "Let them hear. Tell them exactly what happened. Tell them you got put on your ass by a man who just wanted to sit on his porch and drink a beer. Tell them that if they ever think about coming back, I won't be so forgiving next time." Carter's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. His pride had taken the biggest beating of all, and deep down he understood that pressing this further would only end worse. "Go," Daniel said simply. Carter hesitated a moment longer before nodding stiffly to his men. One by one, they limped toward their bikes, some needing to be helped onto their seats. The engines roared back to life, the rumble cutting through the silence of the night. Carter mounted his own bike, glancing back at Daniel one last time. "This ain't over," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his words. Daniel just stared at him. "For your sake, Carter. Let's hope it is." The bikers peeled off, tires kicking up dust as they disappeared down the road, their taillights vanishing into the darkness. Daniel stood still for a moment, watching them go, listening as their engines faded into the night. Finally, he turned to Laura. "You okay?" She exhaled sharply, lowering the shotgun. "I should be asking you that." Daniel smirked faintly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm fine." He looked around at the scattered mess, the spots of blood on the dirt, the crowbar still lying where Carter had dropped it. "We should get inside." Laura hesitated, then nodded. She took one last look at the road before following Daniel back up the steps of the porch. Inside, the house was warm, safe. The contrast between the violent confrontation outside and the peaceful interior was almost surreal. Laura set the shotgun on the table, rubbing her arms. "They'll be back," she murmured, more to herself than to Daniel. "Not if they're smart," he replied. He walked to the kitchen, grabbing a fresh beer from the fridge and popping the cap off. He took a slow sip, rolling his shoulders. Laura eyed him. "You're too calm about this." He smirked. "I've been through worse." She sat down at the table, running a hand through her hair. I don't get it. You're retired, Daniel. You said this life was behind you." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It is, but trouble has a way of finding people like me." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "I just wanted a quiet life, a farm, some good land, a peaceful home with you. That's all I wanted." Laura studied him for a long moment. You don't regret it, do you? Getting involved. He looked at her, his expression serious. I regret that it had to happen, but I don't regret standing up for you, for us. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Laura reached for his hand across the table. What now? Daniel squeezed her fingers gently. Now we wait. If they're dumb enough to come back, we finish what we started. He let out a deep breath, looking out the window into the dark fields beyond. But if they're smart, we finally get some peace. The wind howled outside, but inside, the house was still, safe, for now. The night passed without further incident, but neither Daniel nor Laura truly slept. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustle of wind against the house made Laura's grip tighten on the sheets, her mind replaying the events over and over. Daniel, on the other hand, lay motionless, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. His mind wasn't just replaying the fight, it was running scenarios, assessing threats, strategizing. He'd learned long ago never to assume a fight was over just because an opponent retreated. He had seen men break, watched their fear override their pride, but fear fades and pride festers. Carter wasn't going to let this go, and that meant Daniel couldn't either. By sunrise, Daniel was already outside, his boots crunching over the dirt as he scanned the perimeter of the property. The land stretched wide and open, the early morning mist rolling over the pastures, the sky still streaked with the last remnants of dawn's first light. He had chosen this place for a reason: solitude, peace, a break from the chaos he had spent decades navigating. But trouble had a way of creeping back in, no matter how far you ran. As he approached the barn, he noticed something that made his chest tighten: tire tracks. Fresh ones leading to the edge of the property and then back out. Someone had been here during the night, watching. Daniel knelt down, running his fingers through the dirt, tracing the treads with his eyes. The weight of the vehicle suggested motorcycles, maybe 2, maybe 3, likely scouts. He straightened, exhaling through his nose. They were testing him, trying to decide if coming back was worth the risk. Back at the house, Laura was making breakfast, her movements stiff, tense. She wasn't the type to dwell on fear, but she had always been practical. And practically speaking, they were not out of danger yet. You were out there early, she said, without looking up as Daniel entered, shaking the morning chill from his shoulders. Something on your mind? Tracks, Daniel said simply, grabbing a cup of coffee and leaning against the counter. Laura paused, her hands tightening around the edge of the stove. How many? 2, maybe 3. Just checking the place out. They didn't try anything. Laura let out a slow breath but didn't look relieved. Yet, Daniel sipped his coffee. They're weighing their options. Carter's pride won't let him walk away, not without something to save face. Then what do we do? Daniel set his cup down and looked at her. We prepare. The rest of the morning was spent reinforcing the house, securing the doors and windows, setting up warning systems using basic but effective traps, tripwires that would rattle cans, floodlights rigged to motion sensors, simple deterrents that would give them enough time to react if anyone came back. Laura, ever the sharp thinker, grabbed the shotgun and began checking the shells, making sure everything was in place. Daniel worked outside, ensuring the perimeter was clear, double-checking the tool shed where he had stashed extra supplies. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if one came, he was going to finish it. By mid-afternoon, the tension had settled over them like an unshakable weight. Even their animals could sense it. His horse shifting restlessly in its stall, the dogs pacing the porch. They felt the shift in the air, the unspoken knowledge that something was coming. Daniel checked his rifle again, running his fingers over the well-worn metal. He had put this life behind him, sworn to himself that he wouldn't need to pick up a weapon in anger again. But some things couldn't be left unfinished. Then, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the sound they had both been waiting for finally came. Engines. Low, rumbling, getting closer. Laura looked at Daniel, her expression a mixture of steel and fear. They're coming, Daniel nodded, rolling his shoulders as he stood from his chair. He reached for his rifle, checking the chamber one last time before walking to the front porch. The dust from the approaching motorcycles kicked up in the distance, growing closer, their dark figures silhouetted against the dying light of day. The roar of the approaching motorcycles grew louder, vibrating through the wooden porch as Daniel stood at the entrance of his home, rifle in hand. He wasn't pointing it, not yet. His stance was calm, calculated. Laura stood just inside the doorway, her hand gripping the shotgun, her knuckles white. The dust cloud from the road thickened as 6 bikes rolled to a slow stop just beyond their fence line. The gang had brought numbers this time. They weren't here for intimidation. They were here to finish what Carter had started. Daniel's sharp eyes scanned each of them. Carter, front and center, his lips still swollen from last night's encounter, his narrowed gaze filled with burning hate. To his left, a younger man with a wild grin and shifting eyes, fingers twitching at his side like he was itching for a fight. To his right, an older man with a thick beard, more composed, more dangerous. The rest of the group flanked them, leather vests dusted from the road, the insignia of their gang catching the light of the sinking sun. Carter spat onto the ground, taking a slow step forward. "You really think you can hole up in there like some old cowboy, Daniel?" His voice was laced with mockery, but underneath it, there was uncertainty. "You think we're going to let you get away with embarrassing us?" Daniel didn't move. His voice was quiet, steady. "You got embarrassed because you don't know when to walk away." Carter's jaw clenched. "You really think you're untouchable? That old man's strength of yours isn't going to mean much when it's 6 against 1? Daniel exhaled slowly. "Are you sure about that math?" He tilted his head slightly, and in the same breath a sound echoed from the trees beyond the road, a mechanical click, deliberate, precise. Then another, and another. Hidden among the trees were 4 men, silent, still, camouflaged against the brush. They weren't bandits. They weren't hired guns. They were the kind of men Carter had never dealt with before. Daniel's old unit. Carter's cocky smirk flickered, his confidence shaken. "What the hell is this?" Daniel finally took a step forward, his boots crunching against the dry dirt. "It's me giving you a chance to reconsider." His voice remained calm, even, but it carried the weight of something final. "You brought men. I brought ghosts. And the thing about ghosts, Carter, is that they don't miss." One of Carter's men, a wiry guy with a serpent tattoo down his arm, shifted uneasily. "Carter, this ain't what we signed up for, man." Carter's face twisted in anger. "Shut up." But the tension was shifting. His gang wasn't as sure as he was. They had come for a show of dominance and for payback, but now they were staring down something they didn't understand. Daniel let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing down on all of them. Then he spoke, each word deliberate. "Last night was your warning. This is your only chance to walk away." He raised his rifle, not pointing, just reminding, "Make the wrong move, and you don't walk away at all." For a long, charged moment, no one moved. The gang members shifted, looking at each other, at the trees, at the weapons trained on them from the darkness. Carter was breathing heavily, his pride warring with his survival instinct. Then, slowly, the bearded man at Carter's right took a step back. Then, another. He turned Fax, walked toward his bike, and swung a leg over it. The younger one followed, muttering something under his breath. One by one, they retreated, until only Carter remained, his eyes locked on Daniel's, burning with resentment, but also something else, fear. Finally, with a curse, he turned on his heel and stomped toward his bike. As he revved the engine, he spat one last warning. "This ain't over." Daniel watched as the bikes roared back down the road, their figures swallowed by the distance. He didn't lower his rifle until the sound had completely faded. Laura stepped out onto the porch, her breath unsteady. "You really think they'll stay gone?" Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "No, but next time, they won't get a warning." The evening air was thick with the scent of dry earth and distant rain. As Daniel stood on the porch, his gaze fixed on the now empty road. The retreat of Carter and his gang hadn't settled anything. If anything, it had only postponed the inevitable. Laura stepped beside him, her fingers still curled around the shotgun. "I know that look," she murmured. "You don't think this is over?" Daniel inhaled deeply, exhaling through his nose as he lowered his rifle. "It's not," he said simply. "Men like Carter don't just take a loss and move on. He'll come back. The only question is when." Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. She was no stranger to trouble. Living on the outskirts of town had made her tougher than most, but this was different. This was war looming over them like an incoming storm. She reached out, touching Daniel's arm. "Then what do we do?" Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We prepare." He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the dry dirt as he made his way to the barn. Inside, the dim light cast long shadows over the wooden beams, the smell of hay and oil filling the air. He moved to an old wooden chest near the workbench, the lid creaking as he lifted it open. Inside, nestled among dusty tools and old cloth, lay a collection of weapons, well-maintained but untouched for years. Laura's eyes flickered over the contents of the chest, recognition settling in. "You said you were done with this life," she said quietly. Daniel's hands ran over the cold steel of a combat knife, the weight of old memories pressing against him. "I was," he admitted, "but I won't let you pay the price for my past." He pulled out a revolver, checking the chamber with practiced ease. "They'll be back," he repeated, "and next time, they won't hesitate." As night fell over the farm, Daniel's old unit emerged from the trees, silent as shadows. 4 men, each carrying the weight of years spent in the same trenches as him. Jackson, tall and built like a boulder, nodded toward Daniel as he approached. "You always did know how to pick a fight," he said with a smirk. Daniel exhaled a short laugh. "Didn't pick this one," he replied. "It picked me." The others, Grady, Mason, and Vance, filed in behind him, their expressions grim but ready. Jackson leaned against the barn door, arms crossed. "You think they'll come tonight?" Daniel shook his head. "Carter's mad, but he's not stupid. He'll wait until he thinks we're vulnerable. He'll bring more men, more firepower. He'll want to end this on his terms." Grady, the sharpest tactician of the group, stepped forward. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "We control the battlefield." They spent the next few hours fortifying the farm, positioning themselves strategically, setting up defenses, and ensuring every angle was covered. Laura, despite Daniel's initial protests, refused to be sidelined. She loaded extra rounds into her shotgun, her expression hardened with determination. "This is my home too," she said firmly. "I won't sit back while you fight for it." As the early hours of morning crept in, a single headlight flickered in the distance, then another, then several more. The low growl of motorcycles filled the quiet night air, growing louder by the second. Daniel exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on his rifle. "It's time." The deep rumble of approaching motorcycles sent vibrations through the dry earth. A slow-building storm of headlights and restless engines. Daniel stood motionless, rifle at his side, his gaze locked on the horizon where the first silhouettes of Carter's gang emerged. Behind him, Laura held her shotgun steady, her breathing measured. Jackson and the rest of Daniel's old unit were positioned along the tree line, blending into the shadows, their weapons ready. The farm had become a battlefield before the first shot was even fired. Carter's gang pulled to a stop just outside the fence line. Their numbers nearly doubled from before. They weren't just a handful of troublemakers anymore. This was a full-fledged army of outlaws, armed and brimming with confidence. Carter swung off his bike first, followed by a man Daniel didn't recognize, taller, older, with a weathered face and a cigarette hanging from his lips. The way the others looked at him made it clear. This was someone with real authority. Carter took a step forward, his boots crunching against the dirt. "Told you this wasn't over," he sneered, eyes locked on Daniel. "You had your fun, but now it's time to pay up." Daniel didn't move. "This is your last chance to walk away," he said evenly. The older man beside Carter chuckled, exhaling a plume of smoke. "That's so," he mused. "Carter here tells me you're some kind of soldier." His eyes scanned the farm, assessing. "The way I see it, you got a couple of friends hiding out there, but we got the numbers. You sure you want to do this?" Daniel let the silence stretch before answering. "You're making the same mistake Carter did," he said, his voice steady. "Thinking numbers win fights. They don't. Skill does. Experience does." He tilted his head slightly toward Jackson's position in the trees. "And the men you're up against tonight? They don't miss." The air between them grew dense, tension crackling like a live wire. The older man, who Daniel now assumed was Carter's superior, sighed, rolling his shoulders. "I've seen men like you before," he said, "the ones who think war makes them untouchable. But out here, war doesn't mean a damn thing." He flicked his cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his boot. "One way or another, we take what we came for." Laura took a step forward then, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "This isn't just a piece of land," she said firmly. "It's our home. And if you think for 1 second we're going to let a pack of cowards burn it to the ground, you're even dumber than Carter." A murmur rippled through the bikers at her words. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Carter and his leader. They had expected fear, submission. Instead, they were met with unwavering defiance. Carter's face twisted with anger. "Enough talking," he snapped, reaching for his gun. But before he could even unholster it, the sharp sound of a rifle being cocked echoed from the darkness. Jackson's voice rang out, steady and cold. "You reach for that weapon, Carter, and you won't be reaching for anything else ever again." Carter froze, his hand hovering near his belt. His leader, however, merely smirked. "All right," the man said slowly, lifting his hands slightly in a mock gesture of surrender. "You want to play soldier. Let's see how well you do when the bullets start flying." And just like that, the night erupted into chaos. Gunfire erupted like thunder in the still night, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness as chaos descended upon the farm. Daniel dropped low, moving instinctively as bullets splintered the wooden fence posts. Jackson and his men fired from the tree line, their shots precise, calculated. The bikers, caught off guard by the sheer efficiency of their opposition, scrambled for cover, ducking behind their motorcycles and the scattered debris near the barn. Carter cursed as he dove behind a rusted-out truck, his eyes wild with disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he shouted at his leader, who crouched beside him, gripping a pistol. "They're trained," the older man growled, peering through the darkness. "This ain't some backwater farmhand waving a shotgun." His gaze snapped toward Daniel, who had moved into position behind an old stack of hay bales. That man's seen war. Daniel's mind operated in overdrive, assessing movements, tracking targets. His years of combat had drilled a single lesson into him. Chaos could be controlled if you stayed 1 step ahead. He reloaded smoothly, signaling Jackson with a sharp nod. Jackson caught the cue and moved in tandem, flanking right, forcing the bikers into a kill box. Shots rang out, finding their marks. One biker collapsed, clutching his leg as he howled in pain. Another tried to return fire, only for a well-placed shot from Jackson to send him sprawling. Panic set in among Carter's men. They weren't prepared for this. What had started as intimidation had turned into a full-blown firefight, and they were on the losing end. Laura, stationed at the farmhouse porch, took careful aim with her shotgun. A biker had broken from cover, trying to sprint toward one of the parked motorcycles. She fired. The blast sent him tumbling, his weapon skidding across the dirt. The remaining gang members hesitated, their bravado eroding with every passing second. They had expected an easy victory. They had found war instead. Carter's leader, sensing the tide turning, growled under his breath, "We need to end this, now." He motioned to Carter. "Flank left, get behind them. We take out their leader. The rest crumble." Carter nodded, his expression one of sheer desperation. Staying low, he maneuvered through the darkness, slipping through a gap in the fence line, circling toward Daniel's blind spot. He grinned to himself, adrenaline surging. He could end this. He could put a bullet in the so-called Navy SEAL and take back control. But as he raised his pistol, ready to fire, a voice stopped him cold. "Drop it." The barrel of a rifle pressed against the back of Carter's skull. He froze. Slowly, he turned his head, heart pounding. Laura stood behind him, her shotgun steady, eyes burning with fury. "You came into my home," she said quietly, her voice dangerous. "Threatened my family, tried to burn my land. You really thought you were getting out of here?" Carter swallowed hard, realizing just how badly he had miscalculated. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Daniel and Jackson pressed forward, driving the remaining gang members back. Another biker threw his gun down, hands raised, then another. Fear overtook them. This wasn't a fight they could win. "Enough!" Carter's leader roared, stepping out of cover, arms raised. His voice carried authority, but there was resignation in his eyes. "We're done." Daniel held his rifle steady, studying the man. He saw it, the slight slump of his shoulders, the realization that he had lost. Jackson moved forward, securing weapons, kicking them out of reach. The bikers who remained standing looked between each other, uncertain, waiting for direction. Their leader exhaled slowly. "We walk away now." Carter, still frozen under Laura's shotgun, clenched his jaw. "We can still—" The older man cut him off with a glare. "No, we can't." His gaze returned to Daniel. "We leave. You never see us again." Daniel didn't lower his weapon. His voice was calm but firm. "So you leave, and you make damn sure no one like you ever steps foot here again." A beat of silence. Then the gang leader nodded. "Understood." One by one, the bikers retrieved their wounded and limped toward their bikes. Engines roared to life. Carter hesitated, his eyes flickering with hatred. But when Laura pressed the shotgun barrel just a little harder against his skull, he understood. Reluctantly, he turned, following the others. Daniel watched as they disappeared into the night, dust kicking up behind them. He didn't move until the last tail light had vanished over the ridge. Only then did he exhale, lowering his rifle. The battle was over. The farm still stood. But Daniel knew this wasn't just about tonight. It was about the message they had sent. The kind of men who lived by intimidation, by fear, wouldn't forget this lesson. But neither would Daniel. He turned to Laura, who stood tall, shoulders squared, her grip still firm on her weapon. She met his gaze, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "Told you I could handle myself." Daniel chuckled, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "Yeah," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "Yeah, you did." The dust settled, leaving behind the wreckage of the firefight. The farm stood resilient, its walls still intact, though pockmarked by stray bullets. Daniel scanned the area, his breathing controlled, but his body humming with adrenaline. He knew better than to let his guard down yet. These men weren't the type to accept defeat easily. The leader of the bikers, a man whose arrogance had been stripped away by sheer force, stared at Daniel, then at Jackson, and finally at Laura, who still held her shotgun like she was born to wield it. The air was thick with tension, but the gang leader's next move was crucial. It would determine whether this night ended in bloodshed or an uneasy retreat. Carter, his ego bruised and his pride shattered, stood apart from his crew, still seething with rage. His fingers twitched near his belt, where a hidden blade was sheathed. His breath was ragged, his mind racing with the desire to salvage some semblance of dominance. He couldn't stand the idea of losing, especially not to a man like Daniel, a man he had mocked as nothing more than a washed-up veteran. His jaw clenched as he watched his men hesitate, their eyes shifting between the guns pointed at them and the quiet, unshakable certainty in Daniel's stance. The leader of the gang finally exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. "You made your point," he said, his voice devoid of the swagger it once held. "We're leaving." Daniel didn't flinch, his rifle still steady in his grip. "Not good enough," he said flatly. "You walk away. You take every damn thing you brought with you, and you make sure no one like you ever steps foot here again." The leader studied him for a long moment before giving a curt nod. "Fine." He turned to his men, eyes hard. "Let's go." Carter, however, wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't allow it. "You can't be serious," he spat. "We're just gonna walk away. After everything." His hand darted toward his belt. A mistake. Before he could even draw the blade, a gunshot rang out. Not from Daniel. Not from Jackson. From Laura. The shot hit the ground just inches from Carter's foot, kicking up dirt and making him stumble back. His eyes went wide, his face going pale as he turned to stare at her. She was already leveling the shotgun again, her grip steady, her expression unreadable. "Try it," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Give me a reason." Carter's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His bravado, so carefully crafted, so inflated with arrogance, collapsed entirely. His fingers twitched, but he didn't move. Instead, he shot a glance toward his leader, silently begging for backup. But the leader was already turning away, walking toward the line of motorcycles without a second thought for Carter. "This isn't over," Carter muttered under his breath, voice thick with resentment. Daniel smirked, finally lowering his rifle, but his eyes remained sharp. "It is for you." One by one, the remaining bikers retrieved their weapons, kicking them into the dirt before backing toward their bikes. The roaring engines broke the silence as they prepared to leave. The leader mounted his motorcycle, casting one final glance toward Daniel. There was something begrudgingly respectful in his eyes. "You're not just some farmer, are you? Daniel met his gaze, unwavering. No, a beat of silence. Then, with a rev of the engines, the bikers peeled away, their taillights fading into the darkness, swallowed by the winding dirt road. The echoes of their departure lingered for a moment before the night settled once more, heavy and quiet. Jackson exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he slung his rifle over his back. Well, he muttered, that was one hell of a welcome home party. Daniel finally allowed himself to breathe, turning toward Laura. She was watching the road where the gang had disappeared, but there was no fear in her eyes, only steely resolve. He had always known she was strong, but tonight had proven it beyond a doubt. "You okay?" he asked softly. Laura finally looked at him, a slow smirk tugging at her lips. "I should be asking you that," Daniel chuckled, running a hand over his face. "I don't know what's more terrifying, those bikers, or the fact that you nearly took off Carter's foot without flinching." She shrugged, figured he needed a reminder of his place. Jackson let out a low whistle. "I'll say." The three of them stood in the aftermath, the weight of what had just happened pressing down. The farm had taken damage, but it still stood. Laura was safe. That was all that mattered. Daniel turned toward the barn, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the damage. Bullet holes riddled the wooden planks. The fence had been shattered in places, and the dirt was littered with spent shells. But it wasn't beyond repair. "I'll get started fixing the fence in the morning," he said, his voice steady. "Might take a while, but we'll patch it up." Laura stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll do it together." Daniel met her gaze and felt something settle deep in his chest. Peace. The kind he had been chasing since the day he left the service. Jackson clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I'll stick around for a bit. Looks like you might need an extra set of hands." Daniel gave him a nod of appreciation. "You're always welcome here." With that, the three of them turned toward the house, leaving behind the battlefield that had once been their home. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and gunpowder. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something close to home. He had spent years fighting battles in foreign lands, but tonight he had fought for something different: his family, his land, his peace. And he had won. The battle was over. The farm still stood, and Daniel Hayes was finally home. The bikers were gone, their tail lights swallowed by the darkness, but the weight of the confrontation still lingered in the air like the last wisps of smoke after a gunfight. Daniel stood motionless, his rifle still in his grip, his knuckles white against the worn wood of the stock. His heartbeat had slowed, but the tension in his muscles remained, his instincts refusing to let go just yet. Jackson exhaled loudly beside him, rubbing his jaw as he watched the road where the gang had disappeared. "Hell of a night," he muttered. Daniel let out a breath through his nose. Yeah. Laura hadn't moved either. She was still standing there, the shotgun held firmly in her hands, her chest rising and falling in measured breaths. Her gaze was locked on the spot where Carter had stood moments ago, where her warning shot had nearly taken him out. Finally, she lowered the gun, but there was no shake in her hands and no hesitation. "We should check the house," she said, her voice steady. Daniel nodded, his body shifting into motion as if drawn by muscle memory. The three of them moved toward the house, stepping over broken fence posts and spent shell casings. The front porch light flickered slightly, illuminating the bullet holes in the wooden panels. Some of the windows were shattered, the glass glinting under the dim glow. Daniel pushed the door open, stepping inside cautiously. The house smelled like smoke and dust, the air thick with the remnants of the battle. He flicked on the light, scanning the living room. Nothing too bad, just a broken lamp, a few overturned chairs, and a bullet lodged into the wooden beam by the staircase. It could have been worse. Much worse. Laura ran a hand over the banister, her expression unreadable. "They really thought they could take this from us," she murmured. Daniel set his rifle down by the couch, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension. "They don't know what real strength looks like," he said simply. Jackson smirked from the doorway. "Shayad, they sure as hell do now." The adrenaline was finally beginning to wear off, replaced by the slow burn of exhaustion. Daniel knew it would hit hard later, but for now, he needed to keep moving. He stepped into the kitchen, checking the back door. Locked. The place was intact, just shaken. He glanced at Laura, taking in the way her jaw was set, the fire still burning in her eyes. She had always been strong, but tonight, she had shown something else. something dangerous, something unbreakable. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You all right?" She met his gaze, a small smirk playing at her lips. "I'm fine. You?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Been through worse?" She let out a breath, glancing toward the window. "You think they'll come back?" Daniel's jaw tightened. No. The finality in his tone left no room for doubt. He wasn't just saying it, he knew it. The bikers had gotten a taste of something they couldn't handle, something beyond their understanding. Men like them thrived on fear, but tonight they had learned what it was like to be the ones afraid. And they wouldn't make that mistake again. Jackson leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. "So, what now?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Shall we rebuild?" It was that simple. The damage wasn't permanent. The fences could be repaired, the windows replaced, the fear erased with time. They had fought for this land, for their home, and they weren't going anywhere. Laura nodded, straightening her shoulders. "Then we start tomorrow." Jackson grinned. "Guess I'll be sticking around a little longer then." Daniel smirked. Wouldn't have it any other way. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of victory, of resilience, of a battle fought and won. Daniel looked at Laura, at the home they had built together, at the land they had fought for. He had spent years searching for peace, wandering through war zones and deserts, always looking for something just out of reach. But tonight, standing here, surrounded by the people who mattered most, he realized something. He had already found it. Outside, the night stretched on, the stars hanging bright and endless above them. The road was empty, the dust settling back into place. The farm was still standing, and Daniel Hayes was still here. The night had never felt so still. The distant echo of the gang's motorcycles had long since faded into the silence, leaving behind nothing but the cool Texas air and the faint creak of the front porch as Daniel stood with his rifle still slung over his shoulder. The farm was battered but standing, much like the people who lived on it. He took a slow breath, letting the scent of dust and gunpowder settle in his lungs before exhaling. It was over, at least for now. Laura stood beside him, her grip on the shotgun finally relaxing, but her eyes remained sharp, scanning the dark horizon like she expected them to return. Jackson leaned against the wooden beam of the porch, rolling his shoulder as if working out the last remnants of tension. "You sure they won't come back?" he asked, voice casual, but there was an edge of concern beneath it. Daniel didn't take his eyes off the empty road. "Yeah," he said. "They learned their lesson." Laura huffed a quiet breath, shaking her head. "Took 'em long enough?" She turned, looking at Daniel fully now, really looking at him. The light from the porch cast shadows over his face, highlighting the small nicks and scratches from the fight. "You all right?" she asked. He smirked, a lopsided, tired grin. "You shot at a man's foot tonight, Laura. Pretty sure I should be asking you that." She shrugged, but there was something dangerous in the way she smiled back. He was asking for it. The silence stretched between them, comfortable now, no longer heavy with anticipation. Jackson pushed off the post, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well," he drawled, "I don't know about you two, but I'm getting a drink." He walked inside, leaving Daniel and Laura alone on the porch. The wind stirred the dust in the yard, rustling through the broken fence posts and bullet-ridden barn walls. "We should fix that," Laura murmured, nodding toward the damage. "First thing in the morning." Daniel nodded, glancing around the farm. It had taken a beating, but it would survive, just like they always had. "Yeah," he said, "we will." He turned to her then, his expression softer now, the steel in his green eyes dimming just a little. "You did good tonight," he said quietly. Laura looked at him for a long moment before stepping closer, resting a hand against his chest. "So did you," she murmured. "But next time, maybe warn me before you take on an entire gang of bikers in our front yard." He chuckled, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. "Deal," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. For the first time in what felt like hours, he let himself close his eyes just for a moment, just long enough to let the exhaustion settle in. But it wasn't the same exhaustion he'd felt in war. This was different. This was the kind of tired that came from protecting something worth fighting for. Inside, Jackson clinked 2 whiskey glasses together, pouring them each a generous amount. "To surviving another night in Texas," he said, raising his glass. Daniel stepped inside, taking one of the glasses, Laura taking the other. They clinked them together, the soft sound echoing in the quiet house. "To home," Daniel said simply. The farm still stood, they still stood, and that was all that mattered. The farm had seen better days, but so had they. The broken fence posts, the bullet-riddled barn walls, and the lingering scent of smoke and gunpowder in the air were just remnants of a battle fought and won. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, staring at the vast Texas land stretching out before him. The moonlight bathed everything in a soft glow, making the destruction seem almost peaceful. Laura stood beside him, her fingers brushing against his, a silent reassurance that they had made it through. Inside, Jackson poured himself another drink, muttering something about how the whiskey never tasted better than after a good fight. The weight of the night was beginning to settle, but the adrenaline still lingered in their veins, keeping them grounded in the moment. Daniel finally broke the silence. "They won't be back," he said, voice steady, certain. Laura didn't reply immediately. Instead, she took a slow breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. "No," she agreed, "they won't." She turned to look at him, then really look at him, as if seeing him in a new light. "But what if someone else comes? What if this isn't the last time?" Daniel turned to her, reaching for her hand and gripping it gently but firmly. "Then we fight again," he said simply. "Just like we always have." There was no fear in his voice, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty, the same kind that had carried him through countless battles before, the same certainty that had made him the man he was. Laura studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right then," she said, squeezing his hand. "But next time, let's reinforce the damn fence before we have to shoot through it." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Deal." Jackson stepped onto the porch, glass in hand, watching them with an amused expression. "You know," he drawled, "I've seen a lot of things in my time, but watching you two take on a gang of bikers in your front yard, that's a new one." He took a slow sip, sighing contentedly. "Almost makes me miss the old days." Daniel smirked, shaking his head. "Almost," he echoed. The night stretched on, quiet and peaceful now, the chaos of hours ago feeling like a distant memory. The farm, battered but standing, was still theirs, their home, and they had proven that no one was going to take that from them. Laura eventually pulled away, glancing back at the house. "We should get some rest," she murmured. "Tomorrow we start fixing everything," Daniel nodded. "Yeah, tomorrow." But for now they stood together, watching the land they had fought to protect, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it the only way they knew how, together. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you enjoyed watching justice being served, we've got plenty more where that came from. Click the next video on your screen and keep the action going. Because in a world full of chaos, and sometimes it just takes the right people standing up to make things right.